The Cursed Woman. The cold, metal walls of Vanguard 7, a deep space research station, hummed with the low sound of power generators. It was a place of knowledge, a place where secrets of the universe were uncovered. But there was one secret no one dared to speak loudly: the woman in the dark room. Her name was Zyra. People whispered her name with fear. They said she was cursed. They said her touch was death itself. No one knew where she came from, but every story about her ended the same way. Someone touched her, and they died. She was locked inside a reinforced containment chamber, away from everyone. Thick glass separated her from the rest of the station. No one wanted to go near her. No one except him. The assignment. Lieutenant Ryland Carter stood outside the chamber, watching Zyra through the glass. He was a soldier, but he had been assigned a different kind of mission today. The station commander, Captain Dorn, had given him strict orders. Observe her. Study her. But do not, under any circumstances, touch her. It sounded simple, but as Ryland looked at the woman inside the chamber, he felt something strange. Zyra did not look like a monster. She was tall and slender, with silver hair that shimmered in the dim light. Her golden eyes glowed softly, almost like fire trapped in glass. She wore a simple black jumpsuit, the same one she had been wearing when they brought her to the station. She was not human. At least, not completely. The first encounter. Ryland took a deep breath and stepped closer. Zyra lifted her head, her golden eyes locking onto him. She had been sitting on the metal bench in the middle of the room, her hands folded in her lap. For a moment, there was silence. Then she spoke. "Are you afraid?" Her voice was soft, but it carried a strange weight. Ryland didn't answer immediately. He had read the reports. The last scientist who tried to study her had collapsed after making contact with her skin. He died within minutes. His body was never the same again. His cells had decayed at an unnatural speed. "No," Ryland finally said. Zyra tilted her head. "Liar." Ryland ignored the comment. "I just want to talk." She laughed softly. It wasn't a joyful laugh. It was tired, almost broken. "Talk? That's new," she said. "Most people just stare at me like I'm some kind of nightmare." Ryland leaned against the glass, arms crossed. "Maybe they're just careful." Zyra's eyes darkened. Careful or scared? Ryland didn't answer. Zyra stood up slowly, moving toward him. She walked with a grace that was unnatural, almost like she was floating. When she was just a few feet away from the glass, she stopped. "If you're not afraid, why don't you step inside?" Ryland stiffened. He knew it was a challenge, a test. He could hear his own heartbeat in his ears. "Not yet," he said, keeping his voice steady. Zyra smirked. Smart man. The curse. Ryland had read about Zyra's abilities, but hearing about them and standing in front of her were two different things. "Your touch," he said. "What does it feel like?" Zyra blinked, surprised by the question. "Like dying," she whispered. Ryland frowned. "You felt it?" Zyra shook her head. "No, but I've seen it. I've heard the screams." Her fingers twitched. "I never wanted this power. I never asked for it." Ryland studied her face. There was no anger in her expression. No pride. Just pain. "How does it work?" he asked. Zyra sighed. She looked at her hands. "When I touch someone, something inside them breaks. Their cells, their energy. It's like they can't exist anymore. Like their body rejects life." Ryland exhaled slowly. She wasn't lying. Zyra stepped back and sat down on the bench again. "I don't touch people because I want to," she said. "I stay away because I have to." She looked up at him, and for the first time, her voice trembled. "But what if I'm not the one who's cursed? What if it's this world that's afraid of me?" The decision. Ryland clenched his fists. The station saw her as a threat, but now, standing in front of her, he wasn't so sure. Was Zyra really a monster, or was she just alone? Before he could think further, the door behind him hissed open. Captain Dorn stepped in. "That's enough for today, Lieutenant," the commander said. Rylan hesitated but nodded. Zira didn't look at him as he turned to leave. But just before he stepped through the door, she spoke again. "You'll come back, won't you?" Rylan stopped. He didn't answer immediately. Then, without turning around, he said, "Yes." The door slid shut behind him, leaving Zira alone in the dark once more. But for the first time in years, she didn't feel completely forgotten. The first contact. The cold hum of Vanguard 7's artificial atmosphere filled the empty corridors as Lieutenant Rylan Carter stood outside Zira's containment chamber once again. It had been 3 days since their last conversation. 3 days since he had looked into her golden, glowing eyes and felt something stir inside him. A question he couldn't ignore. Was she really a monster, or had they made her one? Rylan had spent hours reading the files on her. No real name, no official records, just reports of unexplained deaths. Every time someone had touched her, they had died within minutes, their bodies rapidly deteriorating, as if their very essence had been erased. But something about those reports didn't make sense. There were no proper tests, no controlled experiments, no effort to understand why she was the way she was. Just fear and a decision to lock her away. That wasn't justice. It was a prison sentence. And Rylan had never been the kind of man to follow orders without questioning them. The watchful eyes. As he stood there, debating his next move, a voice interrupted his thoughts. "You've been coming here a lot, Lieutenant." Rylan turned to see Dr. Elias Quinn, one of the senior scientists on the station. He was a sharp-eyed man with a thin frame and a constant air of suspicion around him. "Captain Dorn told you to observe, not get attached," Quinn continued, adjusting his glasses. "I'd be careful if I were you." Rylan didn't respond immediately. He had never liked Quinn. There was something cold about the way the scientists spoke about Zira, like she was nothing more than an experiment. "She's not an animal in a cage," Rylan finally said. "She's a person." Quinn smirked. "She's a weapon, Carter. A dangerous one. And if you're not careful, she'll kill you like she killed the others." Rylan clenched his jaw. He had heard enough. Ignoring Quinn, he turned back toward the chamber's reinforced door. With a deep breath, he pressed the access panel and stepped inside. The second meeting. The air inside was colder than outside. The room was dimly lit, with only a single overhead light casting a dull glow. Zira was sitting on the metal bench in the center, her silver hair falling loosely around her shoulders. She didn't move as the door slid shut behind him. "You came back." Her voice was quiet, but there was something in her tone, something that almost sounded like relief. Rylan stepped closer, ignoring the instinctive warning bells going off in his head. The station had drilled it into everyone. Never get too close. Never let her touch you. But today, he wasn't here to follow their rules. He was here for the truth. "I have questions," he said. Zira finally looked up, her golden eyes glowing softly in the dim light. "And I might have answers," she said, tilting her head slightly. "But are you sure you want them?" Rylan didn't hesitate. Yes. The truth about her touch. For a moment, Zira studied him. Then, with deliberate slowness, she lifted her right hand. "Everyone is afraid of this," she said softly. Rylan's pulse quickened as he looked at her open palm. "They say one touch means instant death," he said. Zira's lips curled into a bitter smile. "That's what they believe." "Is it true?" She exhaled, shaking her head slightly. "Not exactly." Rylan frowned. "What do you mean?" Zira lowered her hand. Her gaze flickered toward the walls, almost like she was afraid of being heard. "I don't kill everyone I touch," she admitted. Rylan's breath caught. That was not in the reports. "Then why are there so many deaths linked to you?" Zira's fingers curled slightly. "Because they only let me touch the ones they want gone." Silence filled the room. Rylan's mind raced. Was she saying, that the station had used her as a weapon, that the deaths had been intentional. "I don't understand," he said slowly. "If you can control it, why do they think you can't?" Zyra looked at him then, really looked at him. "Because if they let me prove it," she whispered, "they lose their power over me." The first risk. Raylan felt his heart pounding. If Zyra was telling the truth, then everything he thought he knew was a lie. But there was only one way to be sure. He took a step forward. Zyra's eyes widened slightly. "What are you doing?" Raylan raised his hand, hovering just inches away from hers. "Testing the truth." Zyra stiffened. "Don't," she said, but Raylan didn't move away. "If you can control it, then prove it," he said. Zyra's breathing became uneven. "And if I can't?" "Then I die," Raylan said simply. For a long moment, neither of them moved. Then, slowly, Zyra reached out. Their fingers were just about to touch when the alarms blared. The danger within. Raylan's head snapped toward the door as red warning lights flashed across the chamber. A metallic voice echoed through the speakers. "Security breach detected. All personnel, report to lockdown stations." Zyra's expression turned from shock to realization. "They're coming for me," she whispered. Raylan turned back to her. "Who?" Before she could answer, the doors slammed open, and a squad of armed guards stormed inside. "Step away from the subject," one of them shouted. Raylan didn't move. He looked back at Zyra, really looked at her, and for the first time, he realized what she truly was. Not a curse, not a weapon, but a prisoner. And suddenly, for the first time since stepping onto Vanguard 7, Raylan Carter knew exactly what he had to do. He had to get Zyra out of here, no matter what it cost. Breaking the fear, the blaring alarms sent a sharp wave of tension through the air. The red warning lights flickered, casting eerie shadows along the metallic walls of Vanguard 7. Lieutenant Raylan Carter stood his ground inside the containment chamber, his body tense as armed guards poured into the room. Their weapons were raised, their fingers hovering over the triggers. "Step away from the subject," the lead guard barked, his visor reflecting the dim glow of Zyra's golden eyes. Raylan didn't move. Beside him, Zyra remained still, her breath shallow, her hands clenched into fists at her sides. She was cornered, again. Her entire life had been spent inside cages. First, the cold, sterile laboratories of unknown researchers. Now this lifeless station in the middle of deep space. And now, just when she thought, for a moment, that someone might truly see her for what she was, they had come to take away that fleeting sense of hope. Not this time. Raylan's jaw tightened. "She hasn't done anything," he said, his voice calm but firm. The lead guard took a step forward. "That's not your decision to make, Lieutenant. Stand down." Raylan's fingers twitched toward the sidearm holstered at his hip. He wasn't foolish. He was outnumbered. And these men weren't just soldiers. They were programmed enforcers. They followed orders without hesitation, without question. But Raylan had questions, and he was done ignoring them. Zyra turned her head slightly, her gaze flickering toward him. He could feel the silent warning in her expression. "Don't risk yourself for me." But Raylan had already made his choice, a calculated gamble. He slowly raised his hands, not in surrender, but in strategy. "I'm not standing down," he said carefully, "but I'm also not reaching for my weapon. You need to think about what you're doing." The lead guard shifted his stance. "You're obstructing a classified operation, Lieutenant. If you don't comply, we will be forced to detain you as well." Raylan scoffed. "Detain me? For what?" Talking to her, trying to understand the so-called danger she presents. One of the guards muttered something under his breath. "She's a lethal anomaly, Carter. You saw the reports." "I saw what they wanted me to see," Raylan shot back. "Did any of you ever question why they never ran proper tests? Why they only let her touch the people they wanted dead?" The words hit hard. A flicker of uncertainty passed through the room. Raylan saw the momentary hesitation, the small crack in their unwavering obedience. That was all he needed. "You're afraid of her because they told you to be," Ryland continued, his voice lower now, steady. "But what if you've been lied to? What if her touch isn't the real threat?" The lead guard shifted his grip on his weapon. Doubt. It was there, even if buried beneath years of programmed loyalty. Zura, standing silently, watched the exchange with something close to astonishment. No one had ever spoken for her before. No one had ever challenged the system in her defense. Maybe Ryland Carter was a fool. But he was her fool. A dangerous escape. The hesitation lasted only seconds. Then a voice crackled over the intercom. "Detain them both. Now." "Captain Dorn." Ryland cursed. He should have known. The station's higher-ups had been monitoring everything. This wasn't just about Zyra anymore. They saw him as a threat too now. The lead guard didn't hesitate this time. "Restrain the lieutenant," he ordered. 2 guards stepped forward. Ryland acted first. He moved with military precision, grabbing the closest guard's wrist and twisting hard. The weapon in the soldier's grip went off, firing a pulse shot into the ceiling. The second guard lunged, but Ryland ducked, slamming his elbow into the man's ribs. The room erupted into chaos. The remaining guards opened fire, but not at Ryland. At Zyra. She reacted instantly. Ryland barely had time to register what happened before the air itself seemed to vibrate. Zyra didn't move, but the energy around her shifted. The pulse blasts aimed at her never reached their target. Instead, they dissolved mid-air, as if reality itself was rejecting them. The guards froze. Zyra slowly raised her hands. "You can't hurt me," she said softly, but the room trembled with the weight of her voice. The guards hesitated. Too long. Ryland seized the moment, grabbing a fallen, stunned baton and slamming it into the nearest soldier. The man collapsed with a grunt. "We need to go," Ryland yelled at Zyra. For a second, she didn't move. She just stared at him. She had been given opportunities to run before, but never with someone beside her. Then she made her decision. The air shimmered around her, distorting like heat waves on desert sand. The reinforced chamber doors, designed to withstand direct blasts, buckled inward. Zyra exhaled. The doors exploded outward. The truth revealed. They ran. Down the dim corridors, alarms blaring, warning lights casting shifting shadows. The station was alive now. Security bots activating, lockdown protocols initiating. "Where are we going?" Zyra asked, keeping pace beside him. "Off this station," Ryland replied without hesitation. Zyra glanced at him, truly looking at him for the first time. "You're risking everything for me." Ryland didn't falter. "No, I'm risking everything for the truth." A distant explosion rocked the station. More forces were coming. They didn't have long. But as they rounded a corner, Ryland's mind was racing. He had seen it. Zyra's touch had done nothing to him. The fear, the reports, the rumors, all lies. So the question was no longer, is Zyra dangerous? The real question was, what were they so afraid of? And what secret was Vanguard 7 hiding? Hunted by the system. The alarms howled through Vanguard 7, an unrelenting wail that signaled one thing: containment breach. Lieutenant Ryland Carter and Zyra were no longer just anomalies. They were fugitives. Security drones whirred to life, skimming through the metal corridors in search mode. Automated turrets locked onto motion, tracking their heat signatures. The entire station had turned into a trap, a maze where every path led to capture or death. And yet they ran. The flight begins. Ryland's breath came in steady gasps as he led Zyra through the twisting passageways of the station. He had studied the layouts, memorized the emergency access routes, and yet the walls felt like they were closing in. Zyra moved effortlessly beside him, her presence more of a whisper than a weight. Despite her years of confinement, she was fast, fluid, instinctive. "How do we get out of here?" she asked, her voice even, despite the chaos around them. Rylan didn't answer immediately. He was doing calculations in his head, estimating distances, security rotations, access points. There was one way off Vanguard 7, but it was also the most heavily guarded, the docking bay. "We need a ship," he finally said. "There's a transport hangar in Quadrant C. If we can override the lockdown, we can take one of the shuttles." Zira glanced at him, her golden eyes scanning his face. "And how do you plan to override a system built to keep people like me inside?" Rylan smirked. "Because I know someone who hates this place more than I do. The unexpected ally." They darted down a side corridor, narrowly avoiding the squad of armored enforcers. The station's hollow metal walls vibrated with distant explosions, evidence of Zira's earlier power surge. Rylan stopped in front of a locked door, swiftly entering a security code. The panel beeped in denial. "Damn it," he muttered. Before he could try again, Zira stepped forward. "Move," she said. She placed a single fingertip on the panel. The metal shuddered. The electronic interface flickered, its circuits shorting out in a silent scream. Sparks jumped from the wiring as the lock system collapsed in on itself. The door slid open. Inside, sitting at a cluttered workstation covered in half-finished code scripts and hacked security feeds, was Dr. Elias Quinn. The scientist looked up, blinking at them, as if they were an unusual but not entirely unexpected inconvenience. "You're early," he said flatly. Rylan exhaled sharply. "And you're still alive. Lucky you." Zira narrowed her eyes. "You trust him?" "No," Rylan admitted. "But I trust that he likes screwing over his employers." Quinn smirked, leaning back in his chair. "And I trust that if I don't help you, you'll either get us all killed or make this station implode. So let's talk about how much trouble we're really in, shall we?" The horrifying truth. Quinn turned to his monitors, pulling up classified station records, strings of redacted text, research data, and security logs scrolled across the screens. "Vanguard 7 isn't just a research station," he explained. "It's a containment lab. And Zira, she wasn't brought here to be studied. She was brought here to be engineered." Rylan's stomach tightened. Engineered for what? Quinn hesitated, his usual arrogance replaced with something unsettling. "The reports lied," he said finally. "Zira's touch doesn't just kill. It mutates. It changes things at a cellular level." He pulled up a security feed from one of the lower containment zones. The screen flickered to life. What Rylan saw made his blood run cold. The footage showed a human test subject, one of the prisoners they had quietly disposed of. He had been exposed to Zira's touch. But he wasn't dead. His skin was moving, shifting, warping. Muscles twisted unnaturally. His bones cracked, then realigned. His veins pulsed with black energy, spreading through his body like a virus. His eyes flicked open. They glowed gold. The screen cut to static. Quinn turned back to them, his face grim. "They didn't want to kill you, Zira," he said. "They wanted to figure out how to control you. They wanted to replicate whatever you are. And if they couldn't, they were going to use you as a weapon anyway." Zira's fingers curled into fists. "That's why they never tested me properly," she whispered. "They already knew what I was capable of. The escape plan." Rylan clenched his fists. "How do we shut this down?" Quinn exhaled. "You don't." "Wrong answer," Rylan snapped. "No." "Really," Quinn said, looking annoyed. "You don't. This station isn't just a lab. It's a ticking bomb. If you mess with the wrong system, the whole place goes into a full containment purge. That means every failed experiment, every security measure, and every last thing down there gets released." Rylan's stomach sank. The station wasn't just hiding secrets. It was sitting on a nightmare waiting to unfold. "Then we take what we need and get out," Rylan decided. Quinn nodded. "Already ahead of you. I unlocked a transport shuttle, but you'll need to manually override the launch protocols from the control deck." That means fighting our way through the entire security force, Zyra said. Raylan grinned. Good thing I brought a super weapon with me. The final run. The next few minutes were a blur of movement. Raylan grabbed weapons from Quinn's stockpile. Zyra stretched her fingers, feeling the power hum beneath her skin. Quinn packed up a portable data drive because, as much as he pretended to be a coward, he wasn't about to let years of classified research be destroyed without taking the souvenir. Then, the doors blew open. A squad of enforcers stormed in. Zyra moved first. The air rippled. Raylan watched as a pulse of unseen force erupted from her, sending the first wave of soldiers flying back. Their weapons malfunctioned mid-shot. Their visors cracked from an invisible pressure. She had held back before. Now, she wasn't holding back anymore. Raylan took advantage of the chaos, firing precise shots at the remaining guards. 1 down, 2 down, 3. Quinn ducked behind cover, muttering, "You people are insane." Raylan reloaded. "You're still here, aren't you?" Quinn sighed. "Touché." Zyra turned toward Raylan. "We need to move. Now." They pushed forward, through smoke, through alarms, through the heart of the station that wanted them dead. The docking bay was close. But Vanguard 7 wasn't done with them yet, because waiting for them at the exit wasn't just security. It was something worse. And it had golden eyes. The chase begins. The docking bay doors loomed ahead, just a few corridors away. The sounds of alarms, gunfire, and distant explosions echoed through Vanguard 7 like the station itself was screaming. Lieutenant Raylan Carter gripped his rifle tighter, his mind racing through their next steps. Zyra walked beside him, her golden eyes flickering in the dim emergency lighting. She was focused, deadly. But something was wrong. Raylan felt it before he saw it. The air shifted. A deep, unnatural pressure settled over the corridor, like something immense was watching them. The overhead lights flickered, not from the station's failing power, but from something else. Zyra stopped. "It's here." Her voice was barely a whisper. Raylan followed her gaze down the corridor. The emergency strobes cast long, broken shadows against the metal walls. And then one of those shadows moved. The first experiment. A shape emerged from the darkness. Twisted, inhuman, wrong. It had a vaguely humanoid form, but that was where the similarity ended. Its body was wrapped in shifting black veins, pulsing beneath skin that looked like it had been burned from the inside. Its eyes glowed gold, just like Zyra's. Raylan raised his weapon. "What the hell is that?" he muttered. Zyra didn't answer immediately. She just stared at the creature, her hands slowly curling into fists. "The first one," she finally said. "The first person they tested me on. The first failure." The creature moved. Not with the stiff, clumsy movements of a human, but with something fluid, unnatural, predatory. It took a step forward, then another. And then it vanished. Raylan barely had time to react before a blast of raw force sent him flying backward. His body slammed into the wall, the impact rattling his bones. His rifle skidded across the floor. Zyra turned, both hands raised. The air rippled. A wave of unseen energy rushed forward. But the creature countered it effortlessly. It didn't just block Zyra's power. It absorbed it. The creature's eyes burned brighter, its body growing stronger. Zyra's expression froze. "It's feeding off me," she whispered. The realization hit Raylan like a punch to the gut. They hadn't just tried to replicate Zyra's power. They had twisted it, weaponized it. And now, the thing in front of them was stronger than her. No more running. The creature lunged. Zyra dodged, her body moving like liquid, barely escaping its grasp. Metal walls crumpled under the force of the impact. Raylan snatched his rifle from the floor, fired 3 shots. The plasma rounds burned into its flesh, but the wounds closed instantly. "Bullets won't stop it," Zyra shouted. Raylan cursed. "Then what will?" The creature turned its focus on him. It moved too fast. 1 second, it was 10 feet away. The next, it was right in front of him. A clawed hand lashed out. Rylan had no time to dodge, no time to think. And then, the world shattered. A pulse of unseen force erupted from Zera. The air warped and twisted, and suddenly, everything around them bent backward. The creature froze. For the first time, its movements weren't fluid. They were jerky, broken, unstable. Zera's power was inside it, and now she was taking it back. The breaking point. Zera's golden eyes blazed. "You are not me," she whispered. The creature shuddered. Cracks rippled across its form. Its body, once invincible, now fractured. The black veins pulsed wildly, struggling to hold itself together. Rylan could see the fear in its eyes. For the first time since its creation, it knew it was dying. Zera took a slow step forward. The creature stumbled backward. It didn't understand. It had been designed to kill her, to be better than her. But it wasn't, because Zera wasn't just a failed experiment. She was something more, something the station had never been able to control. Zera raised a hand. The creature screamed, and then it was gone. Its body dissolved into dust, the raw energy of its existence collapsing in on itself. The golden glow in its eyes dimmed. Then, silence. No time to celebrate. Rylan exhaled, forcing himself to his feet. His muscles ached, his pulse hammering in his skull. "Is it gone?" he asked. Zera didn't look at him. "No," she said. "It never existed in the first place." Rylan didn't understand what that meant, but he didn't have time to ask. Because in the distance, the station's final security measures activated. Over the intercom, Captain Dorn's voice echoed through the halls. "You have gone too far, Carter. This is no longer an escape attempt. This is war." The distant sound of heavy metal footsteps filled the corridors. Reinforcements. And these weren't just ordinary guards. They were fully armored kill squads. The final run to freedom. Rylan clenched his jaw. "We need to move." Zera nodded. Together, they ran, toward the only hope they had left. The docking bay. And freedom. But Vanguard 7 wasn't done with them yet, because if they thought the worst was behind them, they were wrong. The truth unveiled. The docking bay was within reach. Lieutenant Rylan Carter and Zera sprinted through the final corridor, their breaths sharp, their bodies pushed beyond exhaustion. The station trembled around them, alarms blaring, security systems failing, and the weight of Vanguard 7's secrets unraveling like a dying star. Rylan could already see their escape, a small transport shuttle, fueled and ready, their ticket to freedom. But they weren't alone, because standing between them and their only way out was Captain Dorn. And he wasn't here to negotiate. The last barrier. Dorn stood tall, his black tactical armor gleaming under the emergency lights. His eyes, cold, calculating, locked onto them like a predator sizing up its prey. Behind him, an entire squad of enforcers lined the docking bay, their weapons raised, their faces hidden behind reflective visors. Zera stopped first. Something was off. Not just the overwhelming number of soldiers blocking their way, but the way Dorn stood so calmly. Rylan slowed beside her, his hand tightening around his rifle. He had fought through an entire station's worth of security, outmaneuvered drones, taken down an experimental abomination, and somehow lived. But this was different. Dorn wasn't nervous. He wasn't even reaching for his weapon. "You fought hard, Carter," the captain said, his voice steady, unaffected. "I'll give you that. But this is the end of the line." Rylan scoffed. "You always were dramatic, sir." Dorn didn't react. Instead, his gaze shifted to Zera. "And you," he exhaled, tilting his head slightly. "You really have no idea, do you?" Zera's expression didn't waver, but Rylan could feel it. The uncertainty. Dorn smirked. You think you're just an accident, a failed experiment. But you were never a mistake, Zyra. You were made exactly as we intended. The secret buried deep silence. For the first time since this nightmare began, Zyra hesitated. You're lying, she said. Dorn chuckled. Am I? He reached into his pocket, pulled out a small datapad, and activated the holographic display. Zyra's own face appeared on the screen. But the timestamp on the file wasn't from when she was brought here. It was from 20 years ago. Zyra's breath hitched. The footage showed a lab, a row of cryogenic pods. Inside them, figures identical to Zyra, some younger, some older, some awake, some not. And then the camera panned to a nameplate. Project, Genesis, status, active subject, Zyra Variant 7. You were never the first, Dorn said softly. You were never even the last. You were just the only one who survived. Zyra took a step back. Her hands trembled. For the first time, Rylan saw fear in her eyes. She wasn't unique. She wasn't an accident. She was one of many. The war for control. Dorn took advantage of the moment. You feel it, don't you? He pressed. That pull, that instinct, the power inside you, waiting to be unlocked. Rylan gritted his teeth. Enough with the mind games, he snapped. You're stalling. Dorn smirked. You think I need to stall? You don't even know what she really is yet. Then, Zyra gasped. Rylan spun toward her and saw what was happening. Her body flickered. Not in a way that implied she was vanishing, but as if reality itself was struggling to keep her defined. The station wasn't collapsing. She was. Her golden eyes burned brighter than ever. Her fingers twitching like energy was surging through her veins, uncontrolled. What's happening? She whispered, panicked for the first time. Dorn's voice was calm. The truth is finally waking up. The final choice. Zyra staggered. The ground beneath her cracked. Rylan grabbed her arm, pulling her back to reality. Zyra, look at me, he said, his voice firm. Whatever he's trying to do, fight it. Dorn sighed, shaking his head. You still don't get it, do you, Carter? It's not about fighting it. It's about accepting it. He took a step forward. You think she's some poor prisoner, some victim of cruel experimentation. Dorn gestured around them. No, Lieutenant. Zyra isn't trapped here because she's a threat to us. She's trapped here because if she ever understood what she was, she'd be a threat to the universe. The docking bay shuddered. The ship behind Dorn rattled as if drawn to her power. The enforcers tightened their grips on their weapons. And suddenly, Zyra stopped shaking. Her breathing steadied. The fear in her golden eyes hardened into something else. Understanding. Acceptance. Power. She turned to Rylan. I know what I have to do, she whispered. Rylan's heart pounded. Zyra. She lifted her hand. The entire station trembled. The endgame. The soldiers opened fire. Zyra raised a single hand. The bullets, the plasma shots, the energy blasts never reached her. They froze midair. Then, in an instant, reversed. The squad was wiped out in a single pulse. Dorn didn't flinch. There she is, he whispered, almost proud. Rylan grabbed Zyra's arm. We need to go. Now. For a moment, she didn't respond. Then, she nodded. Dorn watched them step toward the shuttle. Run then, he said. But know this, you will come back. Because the truth isn't something you escape from. It's something you become. Zyra hesitated. Rylan pulled her toward the ship. The ramp sealed behind them. Engines roared to life. And for the first time, they left Vanguard 7 behind. But in the cold vacuum of space, as they drifted into the unknown, one truth remained. Zyra wasn't just running from her past anymore. She was running from herself, and Rylan wasn't sure she could outrun it. Defying the odds. The stars stretched endlessly beyond the viewports of the stolen shuttle, vast and silent. A distant nebula cast a faint blue glow across the cabin, bathing the metal walls in eerie luminescence. Lieutenant Ryland Carter sat at the pilot's seat, hands gripping the controls tighter than necessary. He wasn't piloting. They were on autopilot, drifting through deep space, light years away from Vanguard 7. But his mind wasn't at ease. He glanced at the co-pilot's chair, where Zira sat in silence. She hadn't spoken since they escaped. She hadn't moved much either. Her golden eyes stared out into the stars, unfocused, her expression unreadable. Something had changed in her back on Vanguard 7. Something Dorn had said, or done, had reached her. And now she was quiet. Too quiet. Rylan wasn't the kind of man who let silence linger for too long. "You okay?" he finally asked, his voice cutting through the low hum of the ship's systems. Zira didn't look at him. "I don't know." Rylan leaned back, exhaling. "Yeah, same. Running, but not free." Their escape had been miraculous. Vanguard 7 should have shot them down before they even left orbit. But they hadn't. Why? Ryland didn't believe in luck. Captain Dorn had let them go, not because he had to, because he wanted to. "You were never the first. You were never even the last." Ryland clenched his jaw. If what Dorn had said was true, then Zira wasn't an accident. She wasn't even a failed experiment. She was a blueprint, a prototype for something bigger, something that hadn't ended with her. "I need to know the truth," Zira whispered suddenly. Ryland turned toward her. Her golden eyes locked onto him, steady, unshaken by fear this time. "I need to go back." Ryland's stomach twisted. Zira didn't blink. "I have to." "We just risked everything to get you out of there," Ryland snapped. "Now you want to throw yourself back into the lion's den." "It's not just about me," Zira said, her voice sharper now. "If I was part of a program, if there are others like me, then they're still in there, Ryland." Ryland knew she was right. That didn't make it easier to hear. Zira sat up straighter, the uncertainty from earlier gone. "You saw what I did back there. I was holding back before, but when I stopped fighting myself, when I accepted what I am, I was able to control it." She clenched her fist. The air around her trembled. Ryland could feel the invisible power humming in her skin. She had awakened something. "I know what I am now," Zira continued. "And I know what I have to do." Ryland rubbed his face. "Dorn is waiting for you," he said. "He let us go for a reason. You think he's afraid of you? No, he wants you to come back. That means he's got something worse waiting for you." Zira's voice dropped to a whisper. "I know. And you still want to go back?" She nodded. Ryland exhaled hard. This was insanity. But deep down, he already knew he wasn't going to let her go alone. "Fine," he muttered, "but we don't go in blind." Zira raised an eyebrow. "What do you suggest?" Ryland turned back to the controls. "We gather intel. Find allies. If there are others like you, maybe we get to them first. Because one thing's for damn sure. If we go back, we're not running this time." His grip tightened on the controls. "We're going back to end this." The search for answers. Their first stop was a black market space station on the outer rim. Echo 4, a lawless hub of smugglers, ex-soldiers, and exiled scientists who had spent too much time looking at things they shouldn't have. If Vanguard 7 had other experiments, someone here would know. As soon as they landed, the tension thickened. People stared at Zira. Not in fear, in recognition. "They know who I am," Zira muttered. Ryland's hand hovered over his holster. "Yeah, and I don't like that." A hooded figure approached them, moving too confidently for someone who didn't know them. "You shouldn't have come here," the stranger said in a deep voice. Ryland tensed. "Not really your call, friend." The hooded figure ignored him and turned to Zira. "You're a ghost," he said. "You should have stayed dead." Zira narrowed her eyes. You know who I am. The stranger hesitated. I knew the others. Ryland's blood ran cold. Others? The hooded man glanced around like he was being watched. Not here. Too dangerous. If you want the truth, follow me. Ryland exchanged a look with Zira. She nodded. They followed. The final revelation. The stranger led them to a hidden chamber beneath the station, buried behind layers of security codes and retinal scans. Inside, cryogenic pods, dozens of them. Ryland's stomach tightened. The pods looked just like the ones from Dorn's recordings. But these weren't on Vanguard 7. These were hidden, forgotten, or abandoned. Zira moved toward the nearest one, her hands trembling as she wiped the frost-covered glass. Inside, a girl, no older than 16. She had silver hair. Her eyes, even in stasis, glowed faintly gold. Ryland's heart pounded. There are more of you, he whispered. Zira's fingers curled against the glass. No, she said softly. She turned, golden eyes burning. They aren't like me. They're just waiting. Ryland frowned. Waiting for what? The hooded man exhaled slowly. For her. Silence. Zira's hands trembled. What are you saying? The man pulled back his hood. His face was lined with age, not from time, but from guilt. You were never meant to be a prisoner, Zira. You were meant to be a leader. Ryland's chest tightened. Leader of what? The man looked at him. The next evolution of humanity. Zira's pulse pounded in her ears. Because in that moment, she realized something terrifying. Dorn hadn't been trying to stop her. He had been waiting for her to wake up. And now it was too late to turn back. Epilogue. The storm that comes next. As Ryland and Zira stood before the frozen experiments, a transmission echoed across the system. A message from Vanguard 7. Zira, we know you're listening. You think you've won something. You haven't. Because this isn't over. This was never about you escaping. This was about you becoming what you were always meant to be. The transmission ended. Ryland turned to Zira. Tell me we didn't just play right into their hands. Zira stared at the frozen figures before her. Then she whispered, I don't know. And for the first time, she was afraid of herself.